Welcome to Leadership and Culture in Healthcare. We're into series 2 and the latest episode where we're talking to leaders of national organisations and their impact on healthcare, both in the NHS, in the independent healthcare, covering it all. And I'm really grateful for Charlie Massey from the General Medical Council, who's joining me today to unpack and unpick what goes on. So, Charlie, welcome. Why don't you let people know who are listening who you are, what you do, and let's start with what on earth does the General Medical Council actually do for those that don't know? That would be a good place to start.
Thanks, Matthew, and great to be here. So I'm Charlie Massey. I'm the Chief Executive and Registrar at the General Medical Council. I've been doing this job now for just over 7 years. And before I came to the GMC, I spent most of my career in government, going most recently from being one of the Director Generals in the Department of Health and going to the GMC at the end of 2016. So yeah, what's the role of the GMC? Well, we are an independent regulator, and that means that we're not controlled by ministers or the Department of Health. We make our own decisions. Our purpose is set out in statute, and that's to support good, safe patient care, working with doctors, patients, and stakeholders. And if you ask most people what the GMC does, they'll probably talk about fitness to practice. And indeed, that is an important part of our role in investigating where there are concerns. But we also set the standards that doctors need to meet, and we also oversee medical education and training. And I think a particularly important part of how our role has evolved over the last period of years, whilst I've been at the GMC, is we've increasingly sought to focus more of our energies and resources on activities that help support doctors in practice rather than acting after things have gone wrong, what we call as upstream regulation. And that includes influencing wider thinking around things like workforce policy.
And so John, that's quite a broad brief, isn't it? So fitness practice, when things go wrong, get that, and the registration that needs to happen to ensure that doctors are fit to do their work, the core requirements of that training, and then the training education. Do you kind of get tensions within that as a regulator between all of those facets of what you are asked to do under statute?
So, I mean, we're a relatively large organisation, so that there aren't tensions in terms of the things that we do in terms of running the organisation. But I do think a challenge that we constantly face is how we can help people outside the GMC understand those things that we do that aren't related to fitness practice. Because when we take action against a doctor's license, which is a very rare thing in overall terms, we've got about 350,000 doctors on register. We will erase maybe 60 or 70 doctors a year, but that is something that does seem to drive people's image and vision of the GMC, whereas actually we put more of our effort and resource into registering new doctors, in quality assuring medical schools, in terms of undergraduate education, in terms of our oversight of postgraduate training environments. So the tension, if anything, is around how we tell that story about the breadth of the things that we do.
And in that respect, if we're kind of tying up the dots here, I, as a job in chief executive, then see that impact on kind of core curricula, I guess, in terms of what our doctors train and what drives their education and how they're ready to undertake their role. I guess it also comes in quite interestingly and importantly in our organizations competent to train doctors to be our future workforce. So you're kind of involved organizationally as well as on an individual level in that basis, aren't you?
Yeah, so we are unusual amongst professional regulators. So the professional regulator, obviously our job is about regulating individual registrants, in our case, doctors. At the moment, though, that will soon have added to it physician associates. But those responsibilities in relation to education and training, you're quite right, do take us into the territory of looking at organizations. And I think that's quite a healthy thing because actually we should naturally be in that space anyway, because if we care about individual doctors, if we're trying to get more upstream in supporting doctors to be good doctors and provide good patient care, we have to care about the environments in which doctors work. And that naturally takes us to questions around how do we engage with organizations, with providers in relation to their leadership, their clinical governance, the environments in which those doctors work. And that's been the territory that we've increasingly stepped into in recent years. And one of the main ways we've done that is by, well, two key ways. One is through the support we provide on the ground, and I can say perhaps a bit more about that later, but also in relation to how we use our data. We have a lot of data through which we can derive a lot of insight, and that can actually help organizations understand the issues that are affecting the medical workforce, and hopefully help those organizations think about how they might be able to fix some of the issues that they face.
Yeah, and I guess that manifests quite quickly when there have been clinical failures. So your point about actually the whole point is to get upstream and support people to be really great clinicians and therefore have great outcomes. But when we look back at some of the serious failings in organizations and maybe, let's say, divisions within organizations, it often comes to culture, often comes to leadership, it often comes to bullying, intimidation, and they've all, I can think of lots of examples, as I'm sure you do. You guys are in the GMC are involved in that often from a registration perspective for the individuals, but I guess also for the education and training. So how do you join the dots with the rest of the national world? I mean, give our listeners a kind of insight into what happens, because I had a similar conversation with Ian Trenholm in the Care Quality Commission on this. How did, when they understand what's going on from their regulatory angle, your understanding, we've got NHS England, we've got other regulators. How do the dots kind of coalesce together to enable a coherent view that is both supportive but interventionist when you're seeing those themes from data?
Yeah. So I'll start at a low level and then perhaps build up.
Sure.
So in relation to what that looks like in practice. So we have a survey that almost all trainees fill in every year, the National Training Survey, and most trainers as well. And that gives us a really quite granular view about what's going on at a site level within providers. So not just in kind of trust X or hospital Y, but actually in department Z, we can see that trainees are saying that they are not getting the level of supervision or support they need, and that guides us to take some really very specific action, and if necessary, very rarely, we can take action to remove trainees if we think that the environment is not safe to them or to the patients that they're treating. So that's a very kind of specific piece. But then it kind of broadens out. So when I talk about data, we look at data across the medical workforce as a whole, and we can see over the time I've been in the post some really quite dramatic changes within the medical workforce. So when I started as chief executive, the bulk of new doctors coming onto our register were doctors coming out of UK medical schools. Within a couple of years of me arriving, we found that the number of overseas trained doctors were overtaking the number of UK graduates coming onto our register each year. In the year we've just had, there are more than twice as many overseas trained doctors coming into our register every year than there are UK graduates. And that's driven quite a significant shift in the makeup of the medical workforce. So we now have a huge number of overseas trained doctors who do a fantastic job and on whom we rely enormously. But I think not everybody has kind of woken up to that reality. So one of the things we do is to then talk to employers about the importance of induction, because this is fundamentally a kind of productivity question for providers. And our data also tells us about the mood within the profession. So we can see over recent years, other than a positive blip during COVID, that doctors have become increasingly dissatisfied and burnt out. Strangely, during COVID, actually, we saw the data move slightly in the other direction. And we've also seen increasing alarms around doctors saying that they want to leave the profession. Now, that hasn't yet converted into reality. But I think that creates quite a burning platform for employers, and again for us to talk to employers about how do we attend to those issues that are driving doctors to want to leave the profession or leave the UK, and how do we address that? Because again, that's a here and now workforce issue, and governments will talk about increases in medical school places and so on and so forth, but none of that's going to materialize for years and years and years. So the focus right now has to be on retaining the doctors we've got, providing them with the support they need, and making them want to stay working in the profession. But to your wider point, there is also, I think, a really important read across in terms of how we work with other regulators. We have, you could argue, quite a cluttered regulatory landscape in health. And from the perspective of a provider, that can feel sometimes quite painful, as people are asking for the same sorts of data in multiply different ways. And so I think it's really important that the GMC and the NMC and the CQC in an English context join up better to both understand what our respective sets of data tell us, but also in terms of how we engage with providers. So we've been doing some work recently with the CQC and NMC to pool our data around maternity, so that we can try and get a better sense of where there may be leading indicators of problems at an earlier stage than otherwise might be the case. And that would, the theory would go, enable actions to be taken at a stage before things became quite as difficult and quite as potentially harmful to patients. And my personal view is that if the GMC is setting standards for doctors in terms of management and leadership that are aligned with what the CQC is requiring from providers in terms of leadership and management, then the whole should be greater than the sum of the parts. So and I think we've made good progress around all of that, but I don't think any of us should ever be complacent. I know that there is much more that we and others need to do, and I'm very committed to seeing that through.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's one of the criticisms when things go wrong is that we in the NHS knew about these things, but in our particular silos. We look. Your point. You looked at the data and said, we kind of had the hunch that that was going on, and et cetera, but it's not then shared. And do you think? I mean, we're recording this for those that are listening during election, but it has been published after election. So I think we're safe to have a conversation out of purdah. But would you envisage that means you as regulators, especially the professional regulators, as opposed to the service regulators like the Care Quality Commission, need to have a much more aligned kind of data set, to have something more fundamental in how you operate together? So I guess you used the word insights are really clear and crucial, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think all of the professional regulators are at a different stage in that process in terms of the data that they hold. I would stop short of suggesting to a new government that we should suddenly aim to take legislation through Parliament that kind of drives us together. I think a lot of this actually we can do off our own back, and I think we are doing it off our own back. But I am conscious. I mean, I made a very specific decision when I started this job to invest very significantly in our data capabilities in the GMC, and that's now giving us a huge amount of really interesting and insightful data, and I know that other professional regulators like the NMC are doing similar things, and that's why we started this pilot, if you like, with the Care Quality Commission and the Nursing Midwifery Council to look at maternity, because it's in a sense a bit of a kind of proof of concept piece of work to say, actually, when we pool this data together and overcome all of the data constraints that exist quite rightly, does that give us a sense of which indicators might be more predictive of problems that are coming, and therefore allow earlier action? And I'm not saying the action necessarily sits with the GMC or the NMC or the CQC, but it enables us to have a slightly more grounded and more evidenced conversation around those things. And I think when we talk about government, I think having having worked in government in my previous life, I think it's incumbent on all of us in national leadership positions to take responsibility for the things that we can do. I don't think we should be trying to put all of those issues onto ministerial desks to resolve. And I saw a fair bit of that when I was sat in the Department of Health. And actually, I think a lot of those issues are things that regulators with providers should be able to resolve, talk through, and work through without needing that political kind of leverage thrown in as well. I think that can sometimes complicate things in an unhelpful way.
Yeah, I get it, because it's that plea that we hear at provider level, isn't it? It's like, well, structural change is not necessarily going to give you the answers to what you're seeking. We can do this stuff, but then, as you say, that's about leadership doing it and seeing it through, which is often harder to do. An interesting challenge then, Charlie. You've got insight, you've got real information. I can imagine at some point, in the state of care reports that the CQC write, say let's take the one you used on maternity, that they're then citing the data from you and the Nursing Midwifery Council to enhance their analysis of what they see from a service sector. Just help people who are listening to understand, where does your remit end and where would you be, I guess, formally handing over to people like NHS England for their statutory roles or integrated care boards to say that we've done what we can do. Actually, this comes down to you. We can plug away at supporting organisation X to get their culture right, to support their doctors, but ultimately there's some systemic leadership failings going on here, and I guess your job ends at some point, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And it would be very easy in my job to take the view that we should just stick to the knitting and do the fitness to practice bit of our job and do the basics of our oversight of education and training. But as with most parts of health, the boundaries are quite complex between different organisations, and I think those of us in national leadership roles need to recognise that we have a systems responsibility, and system leadership requires being able to navigate what can be quite kind of grey boundaries and overlapping boundaries between organisations. So there is definitely a kind of handover, and where we spot problems, where we've tried to focus a lot of our activities is in supporting employers to resolve those. So too often in the past, there may be a problem that manifests itself in terms of a complaint about a doctor, and a doctor gets referred to the GMC, and suddenly the issue gets turned into a fitness to practice process against a particular doctor, when actually there may be an issue with that doctor that needs to be investigated, but actually there are some deeper systemic issues that need to be resolved at a provider level. And so it's incumbent on us to make sure we've got open lines of communication with the CQC, and that's something that now we have in place, and we have it with the sort of CQC equivalents in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland as well. But we've also put a significant degree of additional focus on how we engage with employers locally. So another big change that's happened during my time at the GMC is that we've made some really significant investments. We've more than doubled the size of what we describe as our outreach team. So these are GMC employees who kind of are located across the country, and through them we have relationships with every single responsible officer across the UK. Typically in a secondary care provider, that will be the medical director, but it isn't always the medical director. And when that kind of outreach activity started just over a decade ago, it was very much about the relationship with the responsible officer to talk about doctors who may be in difficulty. But over time, we've really expanded our ambition around that role to have slightly more open conversations around trying to understand and support good clinical governance, and to provide a mechanism through which we can share best practice. So through our outreach teams, we see good, bad, and indifferent practice across the UK. And one of the things I observe in health is that we're not always terribly good at sharing best practice when we see it. So that, I think, is an important role that regulators have, and one that we take very seriously at the GMC. So of course, there are then issues that we, on the training side, we work very closely with NHS England because they obviously have important responsibilities around training, including determining specialty training numbers and all of the funding that relates to all of that. We have nothing to do with terms and conditions for doctors, and it would be kind of wrong for us to engage or comment on those sorts of debates. So we are clear that there are boundaries. But we're quite proactive, and I'd like to think we're quite proactive in terms of feeling that we have something to contribute to national workforce policy debates. And we understand as much as anybody about the structure of the medical workforce, the experiences of the medical workforce. So I think it's incumbent on us to make sure that policymakers in government and NHS England are taking informed decisions about workforce policy that come out of our data. And that requires me and my colleagues to spend a lot of time and energy thinking about how we can gather that data and turn it into a product that is usable and that draws out some of the so what's for policymakers to then kind of run with. And I think we've become increasingly successful at that over the last few years.
Yeah, I have to say this is fascinating. It was fascinating to me. So listeners, I hope it's fascinating to you, because when I was preparing for this, thinking, let me think what I think are the lines between the GMC and supporting culture and leadership in organisations. There weren't that many lines that I wrote down, Charlie, interestingly, but you've just talked about so much more richness, because if we take the fact that we know people stay in their jobs not just because of their pay, stay in their jobs because of leadership and their team and their contentment in their work and the stretch and the adaptability and the flexibility. Everything you just described in terms of your outreach team and your insights speaks to that culture and that approach, both at departmental level and at organizational level. So that's a really key component of the ingredients that allows teams and organizations to provide outstanding care, isn't it?
Yeah, and if I bring it to life, so let's take equality and diversity. Now, one of the so I talked earlier about the changing demographic within the medical workforce. More than half of new doctors are from an ethnic minority background. But we know, if we look at our data, that if you are an ethnic minority doctor, you are twice as likely to be referred to the GMC than if you're a white doctor. And that isn't because ethnic minority doctors are worse doctors than white doctors. It's because of the environments which they're placed, the support they receive, and some of the subconscious and unconscious biases that exist. So we set ourselves an ambition to eradicate that differential kind of data on fitness and practice by 2026, which is a pretty ambitious target, because essentially to address it requires us to address all of the issues relating to racism that sadly does exist within the NHS, as it does within society. And that means that we've had to raise our sights to think about, well, how do we use both our hard and our soft levers to affect that? And so some of the hard levers are that we run free induction training for doctors new to UK practice, which we know has a big impact in terms of helping those doctors land well and equate themselves with things like our standards around consent and confidentiality, which might be different than if you've been trained in India or Pakistan, for example. But we've also been trying to talk to employers about the importance of their investments in induction as well, and not just for overseas doctors landing with them, but for all doctors who are starting new jobs within providers, because it's a sad thing to say, but hospitals in particular can be quite unwelcoming places for people who are landing new, and especially if they're landing in a new country to practice medicine. So that's just one example of how something we see in our data then has forced us to become quite ambitious in how we can use the things that we can do and invest in, like that induction piece that we do, but also try and use our influence to affect others as well. And I think, given the diversity within the medical workforce, which frankly is something we should celebrate. It is, I think, quite shaming to us all that we do see some of those differences in people's experience in the workplace, their attainment through education and training as well. And I think that is, of course, it's an issue of morality and fairness, but it's also an issue of productivity. There is no cavalry of workforce coming over the horizon in the near future. And I think all of us need to be thinking about how do we support the healthcare workforce that we've got, not just doctors, but others as well, to be the best that they can be and to give them the value and support to do that. And if we do that well, not only will they be more productive, but they're also more likely to stay. And those, I think, are going to be important issues that we will continue to talk to governments about in the period ahead.
Yeah, and it's so important, isn't it? Because inclusion, in terms of having an inclusive culture, is about that diversity and celebrating the diversity, but actually knowing that everybody has different reasons for actually they need different types of support. In our trust, we looked at some data recently about, from a different regulatory group, of when people who were trained abroad, overseas, and came to work here, then productivity does drop, because that assimilation is really hard, as you've just been describing. You have to get used to it, and then it does come up. That can breed discontentment with other staff. Oh, I'm taking too much on, and it's about having straightforward conversations and supporting people to know that's what's going on, and using data and intelligence and, frankly, good inclusive workforce practices that accommodates all that, isn't it? Actually, accommodate's the wrong word, because that sounds like we're allowing them to be different. They are different because they're working in a new culture and a new system, aren't they, when they come over from Pakistan or India, if that's the case.
And there are some places that do this really well. So, I mean, my job gives me kind of sight of what's going on in healthcare services across the UK. And there are some health boards in Wales, for example, where more than half of the medical workforce are overseas trained. And I see some fantastic examples of good practice in terms of the support those doctors provide, not just in terms of landing within the work environment, but support with housing, with schooling, with transport, which are so often the factors that can just make people's lives so much harder than they need to be. But I think it's also about how we support colleagues generally. So medicine is a team sport, and that's why we've recently refreshed our good medical practice guidance. So after an incredibly extensive consultation process, and we put a lot more emphasis around teamwork and leadership and our expectations of doctors and what good looks like in relation to that, including how doctors should respond when they see concerns being raised around discrimination, bullying, and harassment. So all of these things I hope will contribute. But we need to recognise, some people find this sort of conversation harder than others. The journey I've been on has been to see the GMC having a really important role in championing fairness and diversity across the NHS, and that's something I am really incredibly personally committed to making a difference on.
So can we talk a bit about that, Charlie? Because 7 years as a registrar, chief exec, that's a good period to be leading change. And you've already, I think, said a few times that you've purposefully done something different in the GMC, how it used to operate. I think you've talked about data, you've talked about the outreach teams, you've talked about changing the way to be almost more preventative and supportive, not just regulatory. How as a leader have you gone about that change? Because that's, it's a long, the institution, and I would call it an institution, the GMC, it's an important institution, and those things don't happen quickly, do they?
No, they don't. And it's a big organisation, GMC, with over 1,500 people. So so these things don't change just because you click your fingers. But so I mean, I'm surrounded by some fantastic people at the GMC. I mean, I'm very fortunate to have landed an organisation that is so competent. In terms of my leadership, I think that you know, part of my pitch for the job was that I had a level of ambition for the organisation that wasn't just about doing nuts and bolts really well, but it was about being a more upstream regulator, and that, you know, requires decisions about where you're investing your resources and time. And as I said earlier, you know, we have invested significantly in our data and insight capabilities, our outreach teams, our policy and strategy capabilities, but we've also at the same time had to expand very significantly all of our activities around registering overseas doctors. So we run an enormous clinical skills assessment circuit, or circuits now, in Manchester, because most doctors coming into the UK have to pass their the knowledge and skills tests that we run. So I think there's something about being ambitious and being clear about where you're making those marginal choices about where you want to make your investments. I think there's something for us as leaders about being clear about what you care about and where you want to make a difference. It's very easy to say, here's my list of 30 priorities, and then none of them can be priorities if you've got a list that's that long. But in a complicated organization, you have to be juggling at least that many things in your mind at any one time. But I, you know, have particularly focused on fairness and diversity as something that I do care about and want to make a difference in. I think it's important to take ownership and responsibility. I mean, like any organization, the GMC doesn't always get things right. We have made mistakes, and I think when we do, it's an important responsibility for leaders to front up to that. And I've stood in front of some pretty hostile audiences over my time as chief executive, and tried to explain the things we've done, but also admit things where we've got them wrong, and then made changes as a result. So, for example, we've changed the way in which we make decisions about whether we're going to appeal decisions that come out of the medical practitioner tribunal service. We've also tried to embed more of a culture of professional curiosity within the organisation. I guess the last thing is just trying to be a good role model. So, and none of us will get this perfectly right because we're all human beings, aren't we? But you know, if I care about fairness and diversity, as I've said, I have to accept also that the GMC needs to have more visible diversity at a senior level within the organisation than we do now. There are many things we do well. We measure our inclusivity. We have an inclusivity index, and our people survey last year told us that we had a 75% positive rating. That's good, but there is much more to do. And my mindset is that in an organisation of, you know, of our size, that is fundamentally about people, we have to have a mindset that is about recognizing that bias will always exist, and we should be wanting to go and find it and address it, rather than having a mindset that seeks assurance that there is no bias ever. And I think it's that kind of open-mindedness, that curiosity, that ability both to bring challenge and be challenged that I think is a really important part of the kit bag of any leader.
And then last few areas, I guess, just thinking about you, Charlie, this is, you've already said, you've just given us your interview again. You know, pitch for the job. I want to make the change, and you know, you can play this back for your appraisal to see whether you've actually done that with your chair, I'm sure. But you come under heat, don't you? As GMC chief executive, as you just say, you've been in front of hostile audiences. You get the vent of people that don't think you're doing this well. You are sitting in front of parliamentarians and being grilled by committees. You're facing in every direction. So how do you sustain that as a leader? Because you're in the eye of many storms in that respect, as well as you say, doing some really important NHS architecture to get it right for 350,000 doctors plus. So how do you do that personally?
I mean, it can be a tough job. I mean, I'm very lucky. I've got really strong team and very stable team around me, and I lean on them. So when I look back on the pandemic, for example, I think the people around me were exemplary in the way in which the GMC engaged with the issues that we had to address. But yeah, sometimes in these roles, things do become quite personalized in terms of when mistakes happen, or when there are particularly vexed debates going on. And I mean, I'm lucky. I've kind of been around the block. I've kind of worked in kind of highly political kind of situations. So there's a bit about me that's kind of developed a bit of a kind of tougher skin over the years. And I think the other thing is just how do any of us keep things in perspective? I'm very lucky. I have a family that I'm devoted to around me, that actually help me keep things in perspective. And a piece of amusement for any listeners. I mean, I'm also I do think it's quite important that all of us have something that isn't just about ourselves at work. So
I'm
although
dying to hear what this is. Does this
well,
involve a
so
ukulele? Come on.
well, I'm not shaped like a kind of an Olympian, Matthew. But I do play quite competitive table tennis in various local leagues, and which I thoroughly enjoy. And actually, I mean, everyone will have their own version of this, but exercise and is really important. I have a couple of dogs that I take out when I can, but table tennis is a surprisingly good source of resilience and perspective as well.
And cunning, no doubt, as well. Maybe you don't want to comment on that. Yeah, interesting, because we need that balance, don't we? I have to say, my team, we've got lots of dogs at home, and my team just sigh when I say, whilst I was walking the dogs, I was thinking, because they always know that means you're just coming up with something different. And it's like, would you stop walking your dogs, Matthew? Because you keep on coming back with more stuff. But you need to decompress in that way, don't you?
Yeah, and I mean, well, likewise. So in the post-pandemic world, I work from home some of the time now. I mean, we're doing this call. I'm actually at home. I will probably go out for a 3 mile walk with the dogs later on, and I will. That's my way of processing things, actually, and that's really, I think, sort of quite a kind of positive and kind of constructive way of doing it. But I think many people as leaders think it's all on them, and I do think it is about how we work in teams. No single individual can possibly cope with everything that gets thrown at them. And I think one of my observations of health, and I've been in the health world my entire career, only landed in it in 2012, is that there is still a little bit of the kind of the heroic leader model that abounds, and I just think these jobs are too complicated and difficult to think that individual heroes can address those issues. These jobs are complex. They are systemic, and actually this is about how do we work through our teams, through our colleagues, through our wider stakeholders to achieve the things that we want. And that requires a level of resilience, a level of thoughtfulness, a level of respect and compassion in the way in which we deal with colleagues. And I think if people do those things well, it's not going to put them far wrong.
Yeah, well said. Absolutely agree with that. Last thing then, Charlie, what are you looking forward to? We're into some interesting territory, whatever the composition of government, which clearly when this goes out, we'll know what that is. Things are tough in the whole of healthcare world, in demand, money, ever increasing technology. You've talked about the really huge systemic changes in the demography of our workforce. So lots to do and lots to grapple with. But what are you looking forward to?
So you're right that there's a lot of challenge out there, and I think it's very easy for any of us to see the challenge and diagnose and talk about problems and the challenges that we face. But I think something I do get truly energized by is just trying to think about, so where are the solutions? What are the so what's to these questions? And I think although things are enormously challenging, I always try to adopt a glass half full approach to thinking about where are the solutions, what are the things that we at the GMC can bring to the table, with a new government, with a new parliament, what are the things that we can do that's going to support that agenda, and doing so in an honest way. We're not political, and sometimes we have to speak truth to power. So I find that very energizing. Within the GMC, I'm excited about continuing our journey to be a more compassionate and a more upstream regulator. We continue to face the challenge about how we tell that story in a compelling way. I mean, as per your point earlier, many of the things I talk about aren't things that naturally people think about when they think about the GMC. So I like telling that story. I do think we've got a lot more to do around fairness, and that's an agenda I'm excited about because it could make so much difference, not just to our colleagues who work within healthcare, but also to patients. And I obviously, I run an organisation that I care about deeply. I want to see the GMC progress. I want it to be an increasingly trusted and confident regulator in setting about its task. And I hope to be here for a little while longer to see that progress happen under my watch.
Charlie, thank you. You've covered a lot. You've talked about how you got into the General Medical Council, what the role of it is in those kind of three big areas, how the nature and the composition of our new registrant workforce is changing massively and has changed massively over time. What that means is that you've had to adopt and change what you're doing, the culture change in how you are wanting and making the GMC change for the future, and how it has that really important role of supporting great care, great clinical environments to both train and be a great doctor, but also those doctors, as you were saying, medicine's a team sport, how they operate within other ecosystems to be really great, and clearly warned off people that when you are out and about, don't take a bet to beat you at table tennis, because they will come off on the wrong end of that approach quite clearly. Charlie, it's been great to talk to you. Thank you for all you do in the GMC and for the insights you've given to this podcast on leadership and culture in healthcare.
Thanks, Matthew. It's been a pleasure.